Deep in the chill of an 1882 London winter, 14-year-old Hannah forced herself out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. She wasn't rising for a joyful occasion, but because severe discipline awaited her if the parlor hearth remained unlit before her masters awoke. Plucked from her rural home, this teenager was thrust into a wealthy urban estate, stripped of any personal time, privacy, or free will. Astonishingly, she was far from alone, sharing this relentless, bleak existence with more than 1.5 million other souls across Victorian Britain. History frequently paints this era as a time of magnificent ballrooms, immense imperial wealth, and dazzling evening galas beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet, lurking behind those opulent mahogany doors and gleaming silver centerpieces were exhausted, unseen individuals wholly controlled by the wealthy elites they served. In this series, we step past those glamorous facades to expose the concealed realities that 19th-century high society worked so incredibly hard to bury. Comprehending the grim truth of these stately manners requires examining the workers themselves, who numbered over 1.3 million in England and Wales by 1881. Overwhelmingly composed of women and young girls, records shockingly reveal that mere children, some barely 10 years of age, were thrust into this demanding labor. Mostly arriving from country villages, these youths were sent away by impoverished agricultural families who simply lacked the means to feed them. For desperate parents, sending a daughter into service removed a hungry mouth, with the faint hope she might occasionally send a few coins back home. The initiation into this life was utterly degrading, forcing vulnerable teenagers to be inspected like cattle by prospective masters inside loosely regulated employment registries. A candidate would stand silently as she was visually scrutinized, aggressively questioned about her medical history and lineage, and then abruptly judged on her worthiness. Documenting her hiring in the 1860s, 16-year-old Ellen Buxton wrote, "The lady circled me twice without speaking, inspected my teeth, and demanded my hair be shorn." Once accepted, these workers entered a rigid, complex caste system ruled by a dominant butler and a strict housekeeper who possessed keys to every single room. Beneath the housekeeper's rule, the ladder descended through cooks, footmen, and parlor maids, finally hitting rock bottom with the scullery maid. Occupying the lowest rung of this domestic ecosystem, these young women were scarcely viewed as human, even by their fellow staff. Her unending duty was to scour every crusty pot, pan, and dish generated by a family that routinely hosted lavish 30-guest banquets. She tackled mountains of dishes armed only with freezing water and caustic lye soap, which tore her hands into a bloody, cracked mess. This backbreaking labor began in the pitch black before anyone else stirred, concluding late into the night after the entire estate slept. Most of these teenagers arrived completely unaware of the torment awaiting them, lured by false promises of respectable, secure employment and self-improvement. To understand the brutal reality, far removed from romanticized parlor paintings, let us examine a typical, punishing day for a Victorian housemaid. By 5 in the morning, 3 full hours before the wealthy family awoke, the maid was already rushing through her silent routine. Banned from burning lights in her own cramped quarters, she blindly threw on her uniform and snatched up her heavy cleaning kit. Her initial chore was grueling, kneeling in the soot of up to 15 fireplaces to scoop out old ash and lay fresh coal. Years of inhaling this suffocating dust caused severe lung diseases, a deadly consequence that employers were fully aware of and entirely indifferent to. Once the hearths were finished at 7, she transitioned to beating heavy carpets and furiously scrubbing massive staircases on her hands and knees. In her 1860s diaries, Hannah Colwick recalled scrubbing icy stone steps without gloves in winter, the freezing water tearing her bare hands open. When the wealthy family finally stirred at 9, a new psychological cruelty began: the strict enforcement of absolute servant invisibility. Expected to vanish like phantoms, servants caught in hallways had to press themselves flat against the walls and stare silently at the floor. To guarantee employers never accidentally bumped into their staff, mansions featured entirely segregated, gloomy stairwells specifically for the help. Dining was similarly isolated. Domestic workers ate downstairs in basement halls, surviving mostly on cheap scraps or whatever the family didn't finish. Nourishment was so inadequate that malnutrition became rampant, with popular manuals like Mrs. Beeton's explicitly calculating the absolute bare minimum calories a worker needed merely to operate. Beyond basic survival, the household was governed by draconian regulations where any infraction brought merciless punishment upon the staff. The strict prohibition of followers meant absolute celibacy. Getting caught with a lover, or even a romantic letter, guaranteed immediate termination. Being fired meant leaving without a character reference, which essentially blacklisted a maid from ever finding domestic employment again and left her destitute. Leisure time was heavily policed, with perhaps a half-day of freedom a week, while any joyful sounds like laughter or singing were strictly forbidden indoors. Consider the tragedy of Sarah Seddon, a 20-year-old housemaid in 1874 Manchester who made a seemingly harmless mistake while working. After 4 years of loyal service, she was overheard humming a tune by her employer and was cast out into the street by sunset for her perceived disrespect. By 10 o'clock at night, long after the final dinner plates were scrubbed and the hearths safely secured, the grueling day finally concluded. Exhausted maids would drag themselves back up those cramped steps to their freezing quarters, knowing the relentless cycle would restart in just 7 hours. Today we associate constant surveillance with digital algorithms and hidden cameras, but the Victorian working class experienced this invasive monitoring long before the internet. The undisputed warden of this oppressive system was the housekeeper, wielding her jangling keys to maintain absolute authority over the staff's private lives. She possessed the terrifying power to barge into any maid's sleeping quarters unannounced, thoroughly rummaging through their meager personal belongings at will. Stripped of all privacy, domestic workers even had their incoming letters intercepted and read by this superior before the envelopes were ever handed over. Masters defended this male tampering by claiming their staff could be plotting with sketchy outsiders. They feared their workforce adopting dangerous notions of personal freedom. Elizabeth Banks, an American reporter who posed as a London maid in the 1890s, documented these appalling violations. She noted her mail was consistently unsealed before delivery. When she confronted the lady of the house about the snooping, she was met with cold indifference. "This is simply how things are done here." Any personal items deemed inappropriate during random sweeps, whether a cherished family portrait or a harmless token, were instantly seized forever without a word. This endless scrutiny exacted a massive psychological toll on the workforce. They quickly learned to bury anything they cherished, knowing visible items would be destroyed. And Sherwood, serving a wealthy London family in the 1870s, managed to carve out a tiny sanctuary. She concealed a journal behind a loose bedchamber brick. Within those hidden pages, she poured out her agonizing loneliness and profound anxieties. She also documented bittersweet memories of her distant childhood home. In her secret diary, she vividly wrote, "I have mastered the art of a blank expression, wearing the emotionless mask my employers demand." She continued her poignant entry. "Yet deep down, my true self remains intact. I am still a human being, even if they refuse to see me." This erasure of humanity was entirely intentional, designed as an ultimate mechanism of control. Masters knew an ambitious worker with independent dreams might eventually quit. Resigning was the singular shred of genuine freedom these women possessed. Consequently, the upper class employed every manipulative tactic available to strip that option away. Vast segments of this domestic history were intentionally erased from public consciousness. Countless silenced women had their tragedies hidden beneath a thick veil of high society respectability. Fortunately, the truth managed to survive in forgotten court transcripts and obscure newspaper clippings. These dusty archives held secrets that researchers overlooked for generations. Pieced together, these scattered documents reveal a horrifying narrative. It exposes a grim reality that elite Victorian society spent vast resources trying desperately to conceal. The darkest suppressed secret was that the sexual exploitation of female staff was frighteningly widespread. It was an epidemic of abuse rotting the core of the English manor. We must label this horror accurately, stripping away polite Victorian terms like impropriety to expose a system of unpunished violation. A maid's legal standing back then was shockingly fragile, as she relied entirely on her master for a roof, meals, and wages. Most crucially, her employer controlled her character reference, a vital document that stood between her and absolute destitution. Lacking savings or family support, fighting back against an employer's advances was virtually impossible, guaranteeing swift and devastating retaliation. The tragedy of Jane Wilbred, a teenage housemaid in a wealthy Bristol home during the 1870s, perfectly illustrates this grim reality. When the 17-year-old fell pregnant, she was swiftly thrown onto the streets without that all-important letter of recommendation. Meanwhile, the baby's father, the son of the master, experienced absolutely no social disgrace, continuing his privileged life without a single penalty. Seeking justice, Jane brought her grievance to court, only to watch the presiding magistrate throw it out with shocking cruelty. The judge astonishingly blamed the teenager, claiming she willingly exposed herself to temptation by simply staying in the home. He completely ignored that she was a trapped, dependent child, highlighting how the legal system reflexively punished the powerless. Jane wasn't an anomaly. Records from the National Vigilance Association in 1885 show hundreds of discarded maids sharing her exact fate. Cast out while carrying their master's children, these isolated girls faced total ruin with zero legal or financial backing. Their only remaining option was the one place every working-class citizen dreaded most: the bleak, merciless confines of the workhouse. Inside those grim walls, families were ripped apart and the desperate inmates were worked to the bone, stripped of their humanity. Beyond exploitation, rampant physical brutality also plagued these grand estates, where striking a maid was technically unlawful but completely ignored by authorities. The gulf between masters and staff was so massive that airing grievances was futile, and speaking out meant jeopardizing the all-important character reference. Losing that recommendation spelled absolute ruin. Yet, this callous disregard for working bodies extended far beyond traditional maids. In 1863, the tragic fate of a young dressmaker named Mary Ann Walkley perfectly exposed the Victorian elite's deadly indifference toward their workers. Rushed to finish an aristocratic ball gown, Mary Ann was forced to stitch for 26.5 continuous hours without proper meals or breaks. Utterly depleted, the 20-year-old collapsed and was dumped onto a sofa inside a suffocating, crammed workroom she shared with 15 other girls. 2 days later she was dead. At the inquest, her employer merely lamented that the tragedy provoked, quote, such an unpleasant sensation. While a furious Karl Marx denounced her fate in Das Kapital as outright murder by overwork, the coroner simply ruled it a natural death. Walkley's demise was no mere outlier. It reflected a systemic, historically verified cycle of erasing the rights and humanity of the vulnerable working class. These laborers were not just invisible statistics. They possessed families, names, and inner worlds just as vibrant as the lords and ladies they served. Yet, despite existing under a crushing regime of constant surveillance, extreme poverty, and total legal neglect, some defiant women carved out ways to rebel. In the realm of domestic service, fighting back rarely involved loud protests. It was far more subtle, tucked away in the shadows of ignored lives. We see this quiet rebellion in Hannah Kulik, the very maid who scrubbed icy steps until she bled, yet secretly taught herself literacy. Hidden from her oblivious employers for decades, she meticulously maintained an extraordinary journal detailing every grueling hardship she endured with razor-sharp intelligence. She wrote without spite, offering instead an unflinching, honest account of her reality that has far outlived the masters who once commanded her. Today, those very journals reside at Trinity College, Cambridge, standing as one of the most vital surviving records of the Victorian working-class experience. Though invisible to the society she served, a mere maid became immortalized, paving the way for the late 19th century's earliest domestic unions. These initial labor groups were highly vulnerable and constantly crushed by aristocratic employers, who found the mere concept of organized help completely absurd. The wealthy elite dismissed the notion of housemaids making demands as a hilarious social joke, yet the laborers banded together regardless. In London in 1872, a clandestine gathering of female household staff took place, meeting in the shadows to fiercely debate their oppressive working environments. Their masters soon uncovered this covert assembly, leading to swift retribution as nearly all the women were fired, scattered, and forcibly silenced within days. Yet, replacement workers quickly filled their shoes, and the spark of collective bargaining, once ignited, proved utterly impossible to snuff out entirely. This resilient spirit lived inside women like Lucy Luck, a workhouse child born in 1848 who entered service at just 9 years old. With relentless grit that defied her rigid station, she meticulously saved her earnings until she could launch a modest business and abandon servitude. Penning her memoir at the dawn of 1900, her tone lacked the explosive fury one might anticipate after suffering such a grueling existence. Instead, her cold, factual clarity hit harder than anger ever could. We were not considered people, but positions, discarded when no longer needed. Such individual triumphs mirrored a broader shift. The rigid Victorian servant machine didn't shatter instantly, but slowly crumbled under forces the elite couldn't halt. The outbreak of the First World War finally allowed impoverished women to enter factories, offering them grueling labor but vastly superior paychecks. More importantly, manufacturing offered strict schedules, meaning that when the whistle blew, these women actually had personal lives beyond their employer's grasp. Following the armistice, expanding educational avenues and better-paying industrial roles permanently lured a newly awakened generation away from the aprons of domestic subservience. By 1951, a million-strong workforce had withered to fewer than 100,000, leaving Britain's palatial estates to slowly transform into echoing, tourist-filled museums. Today, these magnificent estates survive merely as carefully curated exhibits, warmly illuminated for crowds of modern tourists. These sightseers happily stroll through opulent ballrooms and lavish drawing rooms, marveling at the shimmering silver and aristocratic portraits. Yet, an observant guest looking beyond the velvet ropes might discover the hidden, pitch-black stairwells, barely wide enough for a single person. These steep steps lead down to freezing basement kitchens, where the stoves blaze relentlessly and a scullery maid's raw hands never truly dried. Far above, in cramped, low-ceilinged attics, the actual creators of this luxury finally collapsed into solitude after agonizing 16-hour shifts. A profound, heavy silence lingers in these sparse quarters today, much like the hushed existence their inhabitants were forced to maintain. Society naturally immortalizes the wealthy figures captured in oil paintings, etching their aristocratic titles above grandiose entranceways. However, every gilded frame was painstakingly polished by an exhausted worker who rose before dawn and remained entirely nameless to her employers. Women like Lucy, Jane, Sarah, and Hannah never asked for this grueling destiny, yet they endured it with remarkable, unyielding fortitude. Their silent rebellion against the system designed to crush them warrants far more respect than the historical erasure they ultimately received. Ultimately, the towering Victorian palaces were not sustained by the titled lords and ladies claiming ownership over their vast brick walls. They were kept alive by invisible laborers, phantom-like women who flattened themselves against the corridors whenever their masters approached. Masking their true emotions, these maids poured their authentic souls into clandestine diaries, burying their raw words behind loose masonry. Unearthing and honoring those hidden words is our vital duty. Here at the Gilded Trace, we finally speak their names aloud. If these forgotten voices spark something within you, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Another untold history awaits you next week.